Hi, everyone. Pastor Paul Krampitz welcoming you to this edition of From the Pastor's Study. This is part of our series on Luther's Small Catechism, the study version. Recording this here in my study at Bethany Lutheran Church in Cromwell, Connecticut. Today we are moving on in the Lord's Prayer to the third petition of the prayer. Again, if you're joining us midstream on this, the introduction, Our Father in Heaven. Petition 1, Hallowed be your name. Petition 2, Your kingdom come. And today the third petition, Your will be done on earth as in heaven. Luther's question, what is this? Or what does this mean? In fact, God's good and gracious will comes about without our prayer. But we ask in this prayer that it may also come about in and among us. So if you've tuned into the previous two editions of this series, you'll see the pattern there. Again, a prayer that on the face of it can seem to be a prayer on God's behalf, praying for God's name to be hallowed, praying for God's kingdom to come, and now praying for God's will to be done. And then Luther making that same move, reminding us that, well, these things happen irregardless of our prayer. But in fact, as we pray this prayer, we're praying that God's will would be done in and among us. I love this sense of God's will being done on earth as in heaven. Boy, it sure sounds like we're praying for a little bit of heaven to come here on earth. That God's ways, not our ways, would direct the course of human life. At the very beginning of the Bible, in the story of creation, we are reminded that God creates all that exists and calls it good, says it is good. And then things, of course, go awry. Sin enters into the picture. God's will is not done. So as we pray for God's will to be done in and among us, we are praying for obedience to God's will, for us to live out God's intention for our lives, to be loving children of God who are in relationship with God, and who love and care for each other and for God's good creation. When we pray, Your will be done on earth as in heaven, I always think of a prayer for a return to the Garden of Eden, in the sense that we pray for a return to the time when God's will is always done, that we would be more faithful followers of God's will, that we would try to perceive what God's will is for us in the various situations that we find ourselves facing in life. We pray for the wisdom to do God's will. And when we aren't really sure what that is after discernment, we do what Pastor Franklin Fry used to like to call, we make our reverent best guess. We do what we think is right. And that's really all we can do. So we pray that God's will would be done on earth as in heaven. We pray for a bit of God's kingdom to be realized more fully here on earth. It's a wonderful petition in this prayer. Well, that's it for this time. We look forward to now moving on to the second section of the Lord's Prayer. As you will see then, the petitions turn from praying for your things for God and now praying for things for us, for our. Until that time, when I see you again, this is Pastor Paul saying goodbye and God bless.